In 1793, as revolution soaked the streets of Paris in blood, a cloaked noblewoman slipped into the candlelit salon of famed seer Marie-Anne Lenormand. She came seeking hope. Instead, she received a prophecy that would shake thrones across centuries. Lenormand's cards revealed not just the death of kings, but the death of monarchy itself. She foresaw wars, revolutions, guillotines, and the rise of power, no longer blessed by God, but demanded by the people. Her vision didn't just come true. It predicted the very structure of our modern world. If this prophecy stunned you, like the video, comment what moment in history it nailed, and subscribe to see how shadows of destiny still echo through time. The candles flickered in the dimly lit chamber as Marie-Anne Lenormand spread her cards across the worn velvet table, her weathered fingers trembling not from age, but from the weight of what she was about to reveal. The year was 1793, and outside the windows of her modest Parisian salon, the streets echoed with the thunderous cries of revolution. Blood had already begun to stain the cobblestones, and the guillotine's blade had tasted royal flesh. But what she saw in those cards would shake the very foundations of monarchy across Europe for centuries to come. The woman seated across from her was not just any client seeking glimpses of love or fortune. Wrapped in a dark cloak that concealed her identity, she bore the unmistakable bearing of nobility, her hands soft and pale despite the turmoil consuming France. When she spoke, her voice carried the refined accent of Versailles, though it trembled with barely contained terror. She had come seeking answers about her family's fate, about whether the madness consuming her homeland would spread beyond its borders, about whether kings and queens would continue to rule, or if the age of monarchy itself was drawing to its bloody conclusion. Lenormand's reputation as the most gifted seer in all of Europe was not built on parlor tricks or vague platitudes whispered to desperate souls. Her predictions had already proven unnervingly accurate, from foreseeing Napoleon's rise to power to predicting the exact date of Robespierre's downfall. But as she gazed upon the cards laid before her, even she felt a chill run down her spine. The images seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight, revealing visions so vivid and terrifying that she momentarily questioned her own sanity. The Tower card dominated the spread, its crumbling fortress eerily reminiscent of the Bastille's fall. But surrounding it were other omens that spoke of upheavals yet to come, of crowns toppling across distant lands, of revolution spreading like wildfire through the royal courts of Europe. She saw the execution of a king whose massive frame would shake the scaffold, witnessed the assassination of an empress whose beauty had once captivated an empire, and beheld the abdication of monarchs who would flee their palaces in the dead of night, leaving behind centuries of tradition and divine right. As her voice began to weave the prophecy that would haunt European nobility for generations, Lenormand spoke of patterns written in blood and destiny. She described how the French Revolution was not an isolated event, but the first domino in a chain that would topple monarchies across the continent. Her words painted vivid pictures of future revolutions, of common people rising against their royal oppressors, of ancient dynasties crumbling under the weight of their own corruption and the people's hunger for freedom. The prophecy spoke of a great war that would consume Europe, where emperors and kings would send millions to die in muddy trenches while their own thrones grew increasingly unstable. She foretold the rise of new ideologies that would challenge the very concept of divine right, of communist revolutionaries who would storm winter palaces and drag royal families from their beds in the darkness of night. Her voice grew more urgent as she described the execution of an entire royal family in a basement, their bodies thrown into unmarked graves, their dynasty extinguished forever. But the most chilling aspect of her prophecy was its specificity. She spoke of dates and names that meant nothing to a noble client in 1793, but would prove to be devastatingly accurate. She described the year 1917 as particularly significant, when the mightiest empire in Europe would collapse in revolution, its emperor forced to abdicate as his people starved and his armies mutinied. She saw the year 1936 bringing civil war to Spain, where Republicans would drive out their king and establish a republic stained with blood. The cards revealed the personal costs of these grand historical movements. She witnessed the Romanov family's final moments in that basement in Ekaterinburg, saw the terror in young Anastasia's eyes as the bullets flew, felt the anguish of parents who could not protect their children from the consequences of centuries of royal excess. She observed Kaiser Wilhelm II's bitter exile in the Netherlands, once the most powerful monarch in Europe, reduced to chopping wood and writing memoirs that no one would read. As the prophecy unfolded, Lenormand described how the very nature of power would transform. She saw democracies rising from the ashes of fallen kingdoms, constitutions replacing divine mandate, elected officials assuming the roles once reserved for those born to purple. The age of absolute monarchy, she declared, was ending, and in its place would emerge a world where power derived from the consent of the governed rather than the blessing of God. The seer's vision extended beyond mere political upheaval to encompass the cultural and social revolutions that would accompany the fall of monarchy. She witnessed the dismantling of rigid class systems, the rise of the common man to positions of power previously unimaginable, and the gradual erosion of the deference that had once been shown to royal blood. She saw palaces converted into museums, crown jewels displayed behind glass for the amusement of tourists, and former royal residences serving as hotels where anyone with sufficient coin could sleep in beds once reserved for kings. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of the prophecy was its insight into the psychology of fallen royalty. Lenormand described the mental anguish of monarchs forced to confront their own mortality and irrelevance, the crushing weight of realizing that their supposedly divine right was nothing more than a collective delusion maintained by force and tradition. She witnessed the madness that would consume some deposed rulers, the desperate attempts of others to reclaim their thrones, and the quiet dignity with which a few would accept their fate and adapt to lives of obscurity. The prophecy also revealed the role that technology would play in the downfall of monarchy. She saw the power of the printing press to spread revolutionary ideas, witnessed the radio broadcasts that would galvanize entire populations against their rulers, and observed how the speed of modern communication would make it impossible for monarchs to suppress dissent as their ancestors had done. The very tools that kings had used to strengthen their rule would ultimately become the instruments of their destruction. As Lenormand's vision reached its climax, she described the emergence of new forms of tyranny that would sometimes prove even more brutal than the monarchies they replaced. She saw dictators who would claim to represent the people while exercising power more absolute than any king had ever wielded, witnessed the rise of totalitarian states that would make the worst excesses of royal despotism seem mild by comparison. The fall of monarchy, she warned, would not necessarily bring freedom, but would instead open the door to new forms of oppression that would prove even more devastating to human dignity. The prophecy concluded with a vision of the modern world, where the few remaining monarchies would survive only as constitutional figureheads, their power ceremonial rather than real. She saw Queen Elizabeth II reigning over an empire that existed only in name, witnessed the scandals that would plague the British royal family, and observed how even these last vestiges of monarchy would struggle to maintain their relevance in an increasingly democratic world. When Lenormand finally fell silent, the candles had burned low, and dawn was breaking over the blood-soaked streets of Paris. Her noble client sat in stunned silence, her face pale with the weight of what she had heard. The prophecy was not merely a prediction of political change, but a revelation of humanity's inexorable march toward equality and self-determination, a journey that would be written in the blood of kings and the tears of their subjects. In the centuries that followed, every word of Lenormand's prophecy would prove to be horrifyingly accurate. The French Revolution was indeed just the beginning of a wave of upheavals that would sweep away the old order across Europe and beyond. The Russian Revolution of 1917 would fulfill her vision of the mightiest empire's collapse, with Tsar Nicholas II and his family paying the ultimate price for centuries of royal oppression. The German Kaiser would be forced into exile after World War I, exactly as she had foreseen, and the Austrian Empire would crumble into constituent nations, each rejecting the Habsburg monarchy that had ruled them for centuries. The Spanish Civil War would unfold precisely as the cards had revealed, with King Alfonso III fleeing into exile as republicans and fascists fought for control of his former kingdom. Even the specific details of royal executions and assassinations would prove accurate. From the bombing that killed King Alexander of Yugoslavia to the revolutionary tribunal that condemned Louis XVIII to the guillotine. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the prophecy was not its accuracy in predicting specific events, but its insight into the fundamental transformation of human society. Lenormand had foreseen not just the fall of individual monarchs, but the death of the very idea that some humans were born to rule over others by divine right. She had witnessed the birth of the modern world, where power would theoretically flow from the people rather than from God through appointed rulers. The psychological dimensions of her prophecy would also prove devastatingly accurate. The memoirs and letters of deposed monarchs would reveal exactly the kind of mental anguish and existential crisis that she had described. Kaiser Wilhelm II's bitter exile in the Netherlands, filled with regret and resentment, would match her vision perfectly. The quiet dignity of some fallen rulers, like King Juan Carlos of Spain's eventual abdication amid scandal, would demonstrate the various ways that monarchs would cope with their reduced circumstances. Even the prophecy's warnings about new forms of tyranny would prove prophetic. The rise of Stalin, Hitler, and Mao would demonstrate how the fall of traditional monarchies could lead to even more brutal forms of dictatorship. These new tyrants would prove that the problem was not necessarily monarchy itself, but the concentration of absolute power in any single individual or group, regardless of how that power was obtained or justified. The technological aspects of the prophecy would also prove remarkably prescient. The role of mass media in undermining royal authority, from the newspapers that exposed royal scandals to the television broadcasts that brought revolution into people's living rooms, would match Lenormand's vision of communication technology as a revolutionary force. The internet age would further democratize information, making it impossible for any government, monarchical or otherwise, to maintain the kind of information control that had once been essential to royal power. As the prophecy had foretold, the few remaining monarchies in the modern world would survive only by adapting to democratic principles. The British royal family's struggles with scandal and relevance, the constitutional monarchies of Scandinavia that function more as expensive tourist attractions than governing institutions, and the gradual reduction of royal power to ceremonial functions would all conform to Lenormand's vision of monarchy's twilight years. The fulfillment of the prophecy would not be without its ironies. In some cases, the very revolutionaries who overthrew monarchies would establish new forms of hereditary power, with communist dynasties in North Korea and Cuba proving that the human tendency toward dynastic rule could survive even the most radical political upheavals. The prophecy had warned that the fall of monarchy would not necessarily bring freedom, and these examples would prove the accuracy of that warning. Yet the overall trajectory of the prophecy would prove undeniably correct. The age of absolute monarchy, where kings and queens ruled by divine right and could determine the fate of millions with a royal decree, would indeed come to an end. The democratic ideals that emerged from the French Revolution would spread across the globe, transforming the relationship between rulers and ruled in ways that would have been unimaginable to the monarchs of earlier centuries. The prophecy's fulfillment would also reveal the deeply human cost of these transformations. Behind every fallen crown lay personal tragedies of families destroyed, traditions shattered, and individuals forced to confront the collapse of everything they had believed about their place in the world. The execution of the Romanov children, the lonely exile of deposed monarchs, and the psychological trauma of royal families forced to live as private citizens would all bear witness to the human price of historical change. The cards had shown Lenormand visions of specific moments that would define the transformation of Europe. She witnessed the night when revolutionaries stormed the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, their boots echoing through marble halls where czars had once held court. She saw the moment when Kaiser Wilhelm II received word of his abdication, his hands shaking as he read the telegram that ended centuries of Hohenzollern rule. She observed the final breakfast of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, unaware that his empire would not survive the war he was about to enter. The prophecy had revealed not just the broad sweep of historical change, but the intimate details of personal destruction. She witnessed Empress Alexandra's desperate prayers in the basement of the Ipatiev house, her faith in God and monarchy shattered by the reality of revolutionary justice. She saw King Louis XV's final words on the scaffold, his attempt to forgive his executioners even as the blade fell. She observed the tears of Queen Marie Antoinette as she wrote her last letter, knowing that her children would grow up in a world where royal blood offered no protection. Beyond the specific fates of individual monarchs, the prophecy had encompassed the transformation of entire societies. Lenormand had foreseen the rise of the middle class as a political force capable of challenging royal authority. the spread of literacy that would make revolutionary ideas accessible to common people, and the development of industrial economies that would create new sources of wealth and power independent of royal favor. The cards had shown her the emergence of new symbols and rituals that would replace the pageantry of monarchy. She witnessed the red flags of revolution replacing royal standards, saw the Marseillaise drowning out royal anthems, and observed how the revolutionary calendar would attempt to erase even the memory of Christian kingship. The very language of politics would change, with words like citizen and comrade, replacing the elaborate titles and forms of address that had once defined the hierarchical relationships of royal society. The prophecy had also revealed the international dimensions of monarchy's collapse. She saw how revolution in one country would inspire movements in others, how the example of successful regicide would embolden revolutionaries across Europe to challenge their own monarchs. The interconnected nature of European royal families, with their complex web of marriages and alliances, would become a liability as revolution spread from court to court through these very connections. The seer had witnessed the role that war would play in accelerating the fall of monarchy. She saw how the massive casualties of World War I would delegitimize the royal and aristocratic leadership that had led millions to their deaths, how the Russian Revolution would emerge from military defeat and social collapse, and how the German monarchy would fall when its armies mutinied and its people rebelled against a war they could no longer endure. The prophecy had shown her the rise of new ideologies that would challenge not just specific monarchs, but the entire concept of hereditary rule. She witnessed the development of socialist and communist theories that would provide intellectual frameworks for revolution, saw how these ideas would spread through underground networks of intellectuals and workers, and observed how they would ultimately inspire the mass movements that would topple thrones across Europe. The cards had revealed the changing nature of warfare itself as a factor in monarchy's decline. She saw how modern military technology would make traditional concepts of royal leadership obsolete, how mass conscription would create citizen armies loyal to nation rather than monarch, and how industrial warfare would require forms of social organization that monarchical systems could not provide. The prophecy had encompassed the cultural revolution that would accompany political change. She witnessed the emergence of new forms of art and literature that would challenge royal authority, saw how writers and intellectuals would create new narratives of national identity based on popular rather than royal sovereignty, and observed how the symbols and ceremonies of monarchy would be replaced by democratic rituals and republican festivals. Lenormand had foreseen the role that economic transformation would play in undermining monarchy. She witnessed the rise of capitalism as a force that would create new centers of power independent of royal authority, saw how industrialization would transform social relationships in ways that made traditional monarchy obsolete, and observed how the growing wealth of the commercial classes would enable them to challenge the political monopoly of the aristocracy. The prophecy had revealed the generational dimensions of monarchical collapse. She saw how young people, educated in new ideas about human equality and popular sovereignty, would reject the deference to authority that their parents had taken for granted. She witnessed how the sons and daughters of peasants and workers would refuse to bow to kings and queens, how they would demand rights and freedoms that no monarch could grant without undermining the foundation of royal power. The cards had shown her the international spread of democratic ideals beyond Europe. She witnessed how the American Revolution would serve as an inspiration to European revolutionaries, how the ideas of the French Revolution would spread to Latin America and inspire independence movements that would overthrow colonial monarchies, and how the example of successful republics would demonstrate that nations could prosper without kings or queens. The prophecy had encompassed the role of women in the transformation of political power. She saw how queens and empresses would sometimes prove more adaptable than their male counterparts, how the changing status of women in society would undermine traditional concepts of dynastic succession, and how female revolutionaries would play crucial roles in the movements that would overthrow monarchical systems. Lenormand had witnessed the psychological impact of monarchy's fall on the broader population. She saw how common people, freed from the psychological constraints of royal authority, would discover new forms of dignity and self-respect. She observed how the collapse of the great chain of being, with its hierarchical arrangement of all existence under God and King, would force individuals to create new meanings and purposes for their lives. The prophecy had revealed the emergence of nationalism as both a cause and consequence of monarchy's decline. She witnessed how the idea of the nation as a political community would replace loyalty to dynasty, how ethnic and linguistic identities would become the basis for new forms of political organization, and how the map of Europe would be redrawn around national rather than dynastic principles. The cards had shown her the development of new forms of political organization that would replace monarchical systems. She saw the emergence of political parties as vehicles for popular participation in government, witnessed the development of parliamentary systems that would institutionalize popular sovereignty, and observed how constitutions would replace royal decree as the foundation of political authority. The prophecy had encompassed the transformation of law itself as monarchy fell. She witnessed how legal systems based on royal prerogative would be replaced by codes based on popular consent, saw how the principle of equality before the law would replace the traditional privileges of nobility, and observed how new concepts of individual rights would limit the power of any government, monarchical or otherwise. The cards revealed the educational revolution that would accompany the fall of monarchy. She saw how the spread of literacy and learning would empower common people to question traditional authority, witnessed the establishment of public schools that would teach democratic values rather than royal obedience, and observed how universities would become centers of republican thought that would challenge the intellectual foundations of monarchical rule. The prophecy had shown her the religious dimensions of monarchical collapse. She witnessed how the Protestant Reformation's challenge to papal authority would eventually extend to royal authority, saw how the separation of church and state would undermine the divine right of kings, and observed how new forms of spirituality would emerge that emphasized individual conscience over obedience to earthly rulers. Lenormand had foreseen the transformation of military institutions that would accompany the fall of monarchy. She saw how professional armies loyal to the state would replace royal guards loyal to the person of the monarch, witnessed how military officers would come from merit rather than noble birth, and observed how the citizen soldier would replace the feudal knight as the embodiment of military virtue. The cards had revealed the economic consequences of monarchical collapse beyond the immediate political changes. She witnessed how the abolition of feudalism would free peasants to become independent farmers and workers, saw how the destruction of guild systems would enable free market competition, and observed how the confiscation of royal and noble lands would redistribute wealth throughout society. The prophecy had encompassed the international consequences of monarchy's fall. She saw how the collapse of royal legitimacy would undermine the entire system of international relations based on dynastic claims, witnessed how new forms of diplomacy based on national interest rather than royal family connections would emerge, and observed how wars would be fought for ideological rather than dynastic reasons. Lenormand had witnessed the technological acceleration that would accompany the fall of monarchy. She saw how democratic governments would be more responsive to the needs of commerce and industry, witnessed how the end of aristocratic privilege would allow talented individuals to contribute to scientific and technological progress, and observed how the competitive pressures of republican government would drive innovation and development. The cards had shown her the transformation of social customs and cultural practices that would follow monarchical collapse. She witnessed how elaborate court ceremonies would be replaced by simpler republican rituals, saw how the formal etiquette of royal society would give way to more egalitarian forms of social interaction, and observed how the very concept of honor would be redefined around merit and virtue rather than birth and breeding. The prophecy had revealed the emergence of new forms of entertainment and popular culture in the post-monarchical world. She saw how the theatre would move from royal patronage to popular support, witnessed how literature would celebrate common heroes rather than noble protagonists, and observed how music and art would reflect democratic themes and values rather than royal glorification. The seer had foreseen the transformation of architecture and urban planning that would accompany the fall of monarchy. She witnessed how cities would be redesigned around public spaces rather than royal palaces, saw how monuments would celebrate national heroes and democratic values rather than kings and queens, and observed how even private homes would reflect new ideals of equality and comfort rather than hierarchical display. The cards had revealed the changing nature of wealth and consumption in the post-monarchical world. She saw how luxury goods would become accessible to broader populations, rather than remaining the exclusive preserve of royalty and nobility, witnessed how new forms of commerce would emerge to serve democratic rather than aristocratic tastes, and observed how the very meaning of status would be redefined around achievement rather than inheritance. The prophecy had encompassed the transformation of family structures and personal relationships that would follow the fall of monarchy. She witnessed how marriages would be based on love and compatibility rather than dynastic advantage, saw how children would be raised to be independent citizens rather than obedient subjects, and observed how the authority of fathers would be limited by new concepts of individual rights and personal freedom. Lenormand had seen the emergence of new forms of social organization that would replace the rigid hierarchies of monarchical society. She witnessed the development of voluntary associations and civil society organizations, saw how professional groups would organize around shared interests rather than inherited status, and observed how social mobility would become possible through education and achievement rather than royal favor. The cards had shown her the psychological liberation that would accompany the fall of monarchy. She saw how individuals would develop new forms of self-confidence and personal initiative, freed from the constraints of royal authority, witnessed how creativity and innovation would flourish when no longer constrained by royal censorship and control, and observed how the human spirit would soar when released from the psychological bonds of hereditary subjugation. The prophecy had revealed the emergence of new forms of public discourse and political debate in the post-monarchical world. She witnessed how newspapers and pamphlets would enable public discussion of political issues, saw how coffee houses and salons would become centers of democratic deliberation, and observed how the very concept of public opinion would emerge as a force that could shape government policy. The cards had shown Lenormand the rise of mass political movements that would dwarf anything the monarchical world had ever seen. She witnessed how millions of ordinary people would march in the streets demanding their rights, saw how workers would organize into unions powerful enough to challenge the mightiest corporations, and observed how women would fight for and eventually win the right to vote and hold office, shaping the laws that once silenced their voices. Lenormand saw banners rising in hands that had never before been allowed to write history, and in the chants of the crowds, she heard the echo of centuries of suppressed will breaking into speech. The old order, gilded and immovable, crumbled beneath the footsteps of shoeless rebels and factory laborers who now understood the weight of their own work. She saw how revolutions, though soaked in turmoil, would carve paths for constitutions and charters, forging governments not of bloodline but of consent. The cards revealed how the thrones of kings would be replaced by the pulpits of parliaments, and how sovereignty, once the birthright of a few, would become the shared inheritance of all. She watched monarchies dissolve into memoirs, their palaces becoming museums, their decrees turned into artifacts under glass, studied by children learning that power is lent, not owned. Lenormand sensed the trembling of a new moral consciousness that would hold even the most powerful accountable. She foresaw tribunals judging not by favor, but by fact, and laws designed not to protect dynasties, but to preserve human dignity. The scales of justice, once tipped by noble hands, would find new balance in the grip of common people. She envisioned the abolition of torture chambers and the rise of courts that questioned the legitimacy of punishment itself. Through the veil of her visions, she watched the human mind unshackled. No longer tethered to dogmas imposed by divine right rulers, the intellect found new freedom in science, philosophy, and art. She saw schools built where gallows once stood, and libraries where gallant swords had once clashed. Ideas, once censored with fire and exile, now flowed like rivers through printing presses, spreading truth faster than fear could catch it. She saw, too, the wounds such transformation would inflict, the collapse of certainty, the pain of identity lost, the chaos that filled the vacuum once occupied by the crown. She watched as people searched for meaning amid liberty's vastness, sometimes building false idols from nationalism or ideology in their yearning for structure. But the cards never showed her a return to the old world. Even when darkness descended, it came as mutation, not regression. Lenormand stood at the crossroads of centuries, a quiet witness to the unraveling of divine rule and the awakening of humanity's authorship over its fate. The cards in her hand no longer bore the symbols of emperors and queens, but of roads, towers, books, and keys. Not the future of monarchs, but the map of mankind's long walk toward becoming the ruler of its own soul. Every crown toppled, every dynasty shattered, every exiled monarch, all foretold in a single reading. Marie-Anne Lenormand didn't just predict events. She saw a new world, where power no longer passed through bloodlines but through ballots. Her prophecy wasn't just chilling, it was terrifyingly precise. And its final warning, that tyranny doesn't die with monarchs, it only changes its name. If that truth haunts you, comment your thoughts on prophecy and power, like, to honor the seer who saw it all, and subscribe to keep uncovering the hidden visions that still shape our world.